In a world built entirely for men, one name survived the battlefield, not as a legend, not as a myth, but as a warrior recorded by history. She rode into battle, she commanded troops, she killed enemy champions. And even in an age of brutal samurai warfare, men feared Tomoe Gozen. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, leave a like to support this documentary, and comment below where you're watching from. 12th century Japan was coming apart at the seams. The polished structures of imperial authority still stood in Kyoto. Rituals performed, decrees announced, the old language of divine sovereignty carefully maintained, but the words no longer held the land together. Power had moved outward, away from the court and into the provinces, where men with horses, bows and steel decided what was true. The refined world of the Heian aristocracy, poetry, calligraphy, ceremony and controlled intrigue, was being swallowed by something harder, a country where survival depended on force, and where authority only mattered if it could be enforced at sword point. The emperor remained the symbol of rule, but symbols don't stop raids, settle land disputes, or defend borders. The court's bureaucratic system had relied on one fragile assumption, that everyone accepted its legitimacy and played by its rules. That assumption was dying. Provincial warrior families, tasked with managing estates and maintaining local security, grew powerful through practical control of land and violence. They learned quickly that court rank could not match 100 armed men, and once that lesson spread, the center could no longer command the edge. Into this vacuum rose the great clans, the Taira, the Minamoto, the Fujiwara, families that had once served as the empire's military limbs, called upon to suppress rebellions and protect the capital. Over time, they became something else, independent power centers, using the emperor's name when it benefited them and ignoring him when it didn't. By the mid-12th century, the struggle was no longer about serving imperial authority. It was about controlling it, about holding the court as a weapon and using its legitimacy to justify dominance. The emergence of the samurai class was not a graceful evolution. It was a brutal replacement. The warriors who would later be romanticized as disciplined icons of honor began as professionals shaped by necessity, provincial soldiers whose livelihoods depended on fighting, policing, and surviving. Their values were forged under pressure. Loyalty to a lord because a lord meant protection and reward. Personal honor because reputation could decide whether you gained allies or found yourself isolated. Acceptance of death because fear made men hesitate, and hesitation got them killed. These were not philosophical principles floating above reality. They were hard rules learned in mud and blood. As imperial order weakened, war became more than a tool of politics. It became the engine of society. Under the old system, birth and court connection determined status. Under the rising warrior order, advancement could be taken, earned through service, loyalty, and combat effectiveness. A victory could bring land, revenue, and appointments that would have been unthinkable in the closed world of aristocratic privilege. This created a dangerous incentive. Conflict was no longer merely disaster. For many, it became opportunity. As warriors looked at the collapse of stability and saw a path upward, violence multiplied. Clashes that might once have been contained became stepping stones in a broader struggle, and the violence itself was not clean. Later ages would paint this period as noble: formal duels, strict codes, elegant warriors facing death with calm ceremony. The reality was uglier and closer. Medieval warfare meant arrows that found gaps in armor, spears in crowded chaos, and swords used at arm's length when formations broke and panic spread. Men died from bleeding wounds and trampling hooves. Wounded fighters were finished off because mercy was a luxury. Commanders struggled to control battle once it began, and victory often came not through brilliance but through endurance, through grinding an enemy down until their lines collapsed and their will broke. This was not glory. It was exhaustion, terror, and the mechanical work of killing. In 1180, the Genpei War began, the conflict that would decide who held Japan's future. It pitted the Minamoto against the Taira in a struggle that went beyond land and titles. Whoever controlled the emperor could claim legitimacy over the entire realm, and legitimacy mattered because it turned conquest into order. The Taira had dominated the court for decades, accumulating ranks and influence until they effectively controlled the imperial government. The Minamoto, previously defeated and pushed outward, rebuilt strength across the provinces and rose in rebellion. What followed was not a local dispute, but a national civil war that pulled in other clans and turned regional violence into a single, consuming campaign. Over 5 years, the conflict devastated the regions caught in its path and transformed Japan's political structure. The result was a new template of rule: military government, the shogunate, exercising authority in the emperor's name while reducing him further into ceremony. The old idea of power as something handed down through court hierarchy cracked under the weight of reality. War proved what the provinces had already learned, that control belonged to those who could command effective fighters, hold territory, and make obedience unavoidable. Even within the Minamoto versus Taira struggle, there was a deeper tension beneath the banners. The Taira's dominance had been built by operating within the imperial system, collecting court ranks, marrying into the imperial family, turning the capital into their fortress of legitimacy. It worked for a time, but it also created enemies. It fed resentments among those shut out of influence and tied the Taira to fixed positions and vulnerable lines of support connected to Kyoto. The Minamoto, operating from provincial bases and relying on personal loyalty rather than court ceremony, could fight with a different kind of flexibility. Their strength was not in polished titles, but in men who followed commanders because they believed those commanders could keep them alive and reward them when the killing was done. This was the world that forged Tomoe Gozen, not a world becoming enlightened, not a society making room out of kindness, but a country growing desperate when structures collapse, rules weaken, when survival becomes the only order. Ability matters more than expectation. In a stable system, there would have been no space for someone like her to rise through martial skill. In a civil war, where clans needed every capable fighter and the cost of weakness was immediate, old restrictions began to buckle under necessity. The Genpei War would produce warriors remembered precisely because they survived what destroyed most who entered it. And somewhere inside that widening chaos, where reputations were made in a single afternoon and erased in a single mistake, a figure was about to ride into history, not asking permission to exist. The historical sources for Tomoe Gozen's life are thin to the point of irritation. Brief mentions in war chronicles assembled after the events they describe, shaped by male authors writing a warrior culture that did not expect women to fight. We don't have her voice, no letters, no poems, no words recorded from her hand that could reveal intention, fear, ambition, or loyalty. What survives is second-hand. Fragments preserved by people collecting oral accounts, stitching together earlier materials, and filtering everything through the assumptions of their own age. That absence isn't unique. Most fighters from this period vanished into the same dark, but it lands harder here because later society had reasons to make women like Tomoe disappear or to soften them until they stopped being a problem. The main text that names her is the Heike Monogatari, the epic chronicle of the Genpei War compiled in the early 13th century, roughly a generation after the conflict. It describes her in a way that is revealing in its own contradictions. Admiration for her ability, paired with the reflex to frame her through appearance first. The passage says she was beautiful, white skin, long hair, composed features, and then, almost as if the author must justify why she belongs on a battlefield at all, it states what mattered more. She was a powerful archer, and with a sword she was worth 1,000, ready to face a demon or a god, mounted or on foot. It places her directly inside military reality. Yoshinaka sending her out as his first captain, armored, armed, trusted, performing deeds of valor that outmatched the men beside her. That matters because the text does not present her like a campfire invention. It doesn't build her as a miracle. It mentions practical skills, horsemanship, archery, command, details that belong to soldiers, not saints, and it situates her where the Chronicle situates everyone else, inside campaigns and battles that the broader record agrees happened. The tone is the tone it uses for male warriors, direct, confident, unembellished. When the Heike moves into the truly supernatural, its language shifts. Tomoe's description doesn't. It reads like something the compiler believed he had to include because the tradition wouldn't let him erase it completely. So why is there so little else? Because memory is not neutral. Medieval Japanese chronicles cared most about male leaders, lineages, and the mechanics of power. When women appear, they're often framed as tools of alliance, as mothers of heirs, as tragedies, as love. A woman who functioned as a battlefield commander doesn't fit those templates. She doesn't support the story. She breaks it. There was also politics. Tomoe fought under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, Minamoto by blood, but not by outcome. Yoshinaka clashed with his cousin Yoritomo, the figure who would ultimately consolidate victory and shape what counted as legitimate memory. In the world that followed, Yoshinaka's legacy was a problem to be managed. Minimizing his circle meant minimizing her too. A woman attached to a politically awkward commander was easier to reduce to a footnote than to preserve as a full account. And then there's the slow hardening that comes after war. When the chaos ends, societies rebuild rules to prevent chaos from returning. As Japan stabilized and hierarchy became more rigid, there was little appetite to keep detailed records of women who had violated expected roles, even if they did so under the pressure of survival. The post-war order needed the battlefield to belong to men. Stories like Tomoe's suggested it never truly did. Within those limits, we can still say a few things with reasonable certainty. Tomoe existed. She served under Yoshinaka in the Genpei War. She fought across multiple campaigns between roughly 1180 and 1184. She was not a symbolic presence or a camp follower. She held command, and she was remembered as exceptionally capable. The specificity of her skills, her placement within real operations, and the matter-of-fact way she is described all point in one direction. She was not created to decorate the story. She was recorded because she couldn't be ignored, but what later centuries did with her is just as telling as what they preserved. Over time, Tomoe's story was reshaped to meet the needs of more controlled eras. As the warrior class hardened into hereditary status and gender roles became more enforced, her edge was filed down. Later, retellings leaned toward romance, turning loyalty into devotion and military service into emotional attachment. Visual depictions increasingly emphasized elegance and beauty, details that made her easier to contain, while her competence and violence were treated as an exotic exception instead of a professional fact. The woman who had killed enemy warriors and led men into battle was slowly rewritten into a safer shape, a heroine whose most important relationship was not to war, but to a man. This is where myth and record split. The record shows a combatant, a commander trusted with first action, a fighter described in the same language applied to male warriors, a presence in real battles. Myth is what happens when later societies cannot accept what the record implies. Myth insists she fought because of love, not skill. Myth treats her as a singular marvel, so the system doesn't have to be questioned. Myth gives her endings that restore order, that return her to an acceptable frame. And the official histories, the genealogies, the administrative records, the narratives sponsored by later governments, largely chose silence. That silence isn't empty, it has shape. It reflects decisions about what kinds of memories support the social order. Shogunates built on warrior rule also needed clear hierarchies to keep that rule stable. including strict gender boundaries. A woman who proved that battlefield competence did not belong exclusively to men complicated everything. So the story is either buried or converted into romance or treated as a harmless anomaly. Paradoxically, the scarcity strengthens the case for her reality. If Tomoe were purely invented, we'd expect more. Elaborate episodes, miracles, a larger mythology growing around her. Instead, we get fragments, brief, awkward, uncomfortably direct, the kind of material that survives not because it is convenient, but because it was already known, already repeated, already too embedded to erase cleanly. The distortions that followed looked less like celebration and more like containment. What emerges from the sources is not a complete biography. It's something colder, proof that in the Genpei War's chaos, a woman fought at the highest levels and was remembered for it. Whether she was truly unique, or whether she represents only the single name that slipped through the cracks of erasure, can't be proven. But her presence in the record is enough to make the question unavoidable. Tomoe Gozen was real. The real mystery is what happened after the record stops, what she did when the war turned against her, and why the story of a battlefield commander ends in silence just before the world closes its doors again. In 12th century Japan, especially inside warrior households, a woman's role was defined with quiet precision. She managed the home while men went to war. She oversaw estates, stored grain, negotiated household labor, and kept the economic machinery running so campaigns could continue. She raised children who would carry the line forward. She formed marriage alliances that tightened clan networks and turned blood into strategy. Women could inherit property and wield real authority, but it was meant to remain inside the domestic sphere. Power exercised through husbands, sons, and male relatives, not directly in public or on a battlefield. Even when a woman was taught to fight, it was framed as contingency, the last defense of the household when the men were gone. Not preparation for marching out with an army, not for command, not for killing strangers under a war banner. That is what makes the silence in the sources so telling. There is little need for explicit prohibition when something is considered unthinkable. The gender order of the period didn't simply discourage women from warfare. It organized life around the assumption that the battlefield belonged to men, and that women belonged everywhere else. Japanese tradition did have a category for female martial ability, the onna-bugeisha. But that category was narrower than later imagery suggests. These were typically noble women, trained to protect their families during emergencies, when raids or assaults reached the doorstep and there was no one else left to hold the line. Their training emphasized defensive purpose, saving the household, delaying attackers, preventing capture. It focused on weapons suited to controlled space and defensive distance, especially the naginata, a polearm that could keep an enemy away without demanding the same kind of close-quarters strength and grappling power expected in sword combat. The onna-bugeisha tradition was an expansion of acceptable roles under crisis, but it remained bounded. It was defense of what was already yours. It was not participation in the campaigns that defined samurai identity. Tomoe Gozen does not fit inside that box. The sources do not place her behind walls, protecting a residence. They place her with an army. They do not describe her as an emergency defender, reacting to invasion. They describe her riding out before battle, sent forward as Minamoto no Yoshinaka's first captain. They do not associate her with the household weapon that later tradition made symbolic of women's defense. They describe her with the tools of offensive warfare, a powerful bow and an oversized sword. Most revealing of all, she is not described in a separate category, a woman who fought, but measured directly against men, credited with more deeds of valor than Yoshinaka's other warriors. The framing is blunt. She was doing the same work, in the same space, under the same conditions, and she was not surviving by being protected. For that to be possible, her training could not have been casual. It would have had to begin early, and continue long past the point where custom would have insisted it was pointless. Battlefield archery demanded years of conditioning, accuracy under pressure, and the ability to shoot effectively from horseback. Swordsmanship meant more than technique. It meant instinct, endurance, the nerve to close distance, and the willingness to finish what you started. And the horsemanship described in the chronicle, handling unbroken horses, riding down perilous descents, was not a skill you acquired in secret between household tasks. It was the kind of education male warriors received as a foundation of their identity. That raises an uncomfortable question. Who allowed it? Someone had to teach her. Someone had to keep teaching her. Someone had to decide, against social pressure and expectation, that the training would not stop simply because she was not supposed to need it. Whether that came from unusual family circumstances or from Tomoe's own insistence and undeniable aptitude, the result was the same. She crossed a line most women never even approached. But skill alone does not explain what the sources imply. The most radical element isn't that she fought, it's that she led. The Heike Monogatari doesn't describe her as a brave presence among men. It specifies a role, first captain. That is a command position, not an honorific. It suggests responsibility, directing fighters, reading the moment, holding discipline when formations broke and panic spread. Command required more than personal strength. It demanded judgment, composure under pressure, and authority strong enough that other warriors would follow orders even when those orders took them into killing range. Warrior culture was intensely hierarchical and intensely masculine. Command was one of its purest expressions of power. A woman issuing orders in that space was not a small exception. It was an inversion, and yet the sources present it as functional. Not as spectacle, not as absurdity, but as something Yoshinaka relied on whenever a battle was imminent. That repetition matters. It implies she proved herself in action, enough times that whatever doubt existed had to compete with results. In war, prejudice survives best when failure is survivable. In the Genpei War's pressure, failure meant death. That is the only reason this kind of role could exist at all. Not because the world suddenly respected women, but because desperation rewards competence with brutal indifference. Tomoe's placement in decisive fighting reinforces the same point. She's not kept to the margins, deployed where the risk is low, and the story can be used safely. The Chronicle places her where commanders would have needed their most effective people. Moments when a campaign's direction could collapse in a single misjudgment. That doesn't read like symbolism. It reads like necessity. In a war like this, no leader could afford to waste a battlefield asset for the sake of propriety. What Tomoe represents, then, is not a gentle expansion of acceptable female roles. It is a rupture. She did not defend the home. She rode out to meet enemies. She did not occupy a defensive exception. She took an offensive function. She did not serve as support. She exercised authority. She did not appear in minor moments. She moved through the war's critical spaces. Every detail preserved about her points to the same conclusion. She wasn't tolerated as a curiosity. She was used because she worked. And that leaves the question that history tries to avoid. If Tomoe could exist in the open, commanding men, killing on campaign, recorded as a warrior among warriors, then how many others existed in the margins, unrecorded, unnamed, erased not by the violence of war, but by the order that followed it? Minamoto no Yoshinaka was a complicated figure inside the Genpei War. Brilliant in the field, reckless in politics, capable of spectacular victories and equally spectacular mistakes. The very fact that he relied on Tomoe Gozen as a primary battlefield asset exposes the kind of commander he was. Pragmatic enough to ignore convention when convention threatened efficiency, and desperate enough to bet on proven competence over social expectation. Yoshinaka was Minamoto by blood, but he did not grow up at the center of Minamoto power. After his father was killed in earlier conflicts, he was raised in the provinces, far from Kyoto's court habits and far from the careful inherited instincts of men trained for politics as much as war. That provincial distance shaped him. It made him tactically flexible, unburdened by old etiquette. but it also left him politically blunt, less skilled at the quiet management of rivals and alliances that decides who survives after the battle ends. He built his force from provincial warriors who followed him by personal loyalty and demonstrated results, not because of refined hierarchies or inherited obligation. His army was not a machine of tradition. It was a coalition held together by trust and momentum. In that kind of structure, Tomoe's gender mattered less than what she could do. Yoshinaka needed fighters who could execute complex operations and hold themselves together when chaos swallowed the plan. Tomoe had proven she could, and every time she delivered, her presence became harder to challenge, not because the world softened, but because war doesn't tolerate waste. The loyalty between Tomoe and Yoshinaka reads as mutual and personal. Military loyalty in its most practical form, not the romantic devotion later retellings tried to impose. Medieval warfare ran on bonds between a commander and the people who fought for him. Warriors served men, not ideals. They followed a lord they trusted to reward them, protect them, and deploy them well. The arrangement was transactional, but it was also intimate in the way shared violence makes people intimate, built through survival, exposure, and obligations paid in blood. Nothing in the sources requires a love story. What they describe is partnership, a commander who valued a retainer's capabilities enough to keep placing them at the center of the fighting, and a warrior who repeatedly justified that choice. Yoshinaka's assignments reveal how deep that trust ran. The Heike Monogatari says he sent Tomoe out as his first captain whenever battle was imminent. That phrasing isn't decorative. It implies a pattern, not a single moment of exceptional display, but repeated deployment at the point of contact. The vanguard, where the first collision happens, where information is thin, where the line either holds or collapses. Vanguard work was not reserved for those a commander wanted to protect. It was for those he could not afford to lose control without. It demanded judgment under pressure, knowing when to press, when to withdraw, and how to buy time for the main force to assemble. A commander sends his most reliable people into that darkness because he needs outcomes, not courage alone. And when the vanguard failed, the battle turned into something worse. Medieval Japanese battles frequently dissolved into close-range chaos, formations breaking, orders becoming noise, the fight collapsing into clusters of men trying to stay alive. In that space, individual capability mattered in a way no hierarchy could override. Technical skill with weapons mattered, but so did endurance, strength, and the ability to function while exhausted, surrounded, and half-blind with fear and blood. The Chronicles phrase, "a warrior worth 1,000, is often read as poetry. In context, it's closer to assessment. It marks someone whose effectiveness changes the equation. A fighter whose presence multiplies what a commander can do, whose performance can stabilize a moment that would otherwise collapse. This is the level the sources place her at. Tomoe is also associated with the kind of combat commanders valued most, the hunt for enemy leaders. In medieval warfare, killing or capturing commanders could fracture an opposing force, break morale, and create openings that ordinary slaughter could not. But leadership targets were rarely exposed. They were guarded, they were capable. Reaching them meant cutting through protection and surviving the fight that followed. Warriors who attempted it were gambling their lives for decisive impact, and those who succeeded earned prestige because they proved more than bravery. They proved judgment and timing. The Chronicles language, ready to confront a demon or a god, signals the reputation such a role required. Not merely skilled, but fearlessly functional against the most dangerous opponents on the field. Yet raw ferocity was not enough. What separated a usable warrior from a liability was discipline. Battle is not just violence. It is confusion, noise, exhaustion, terror, and the constant temptation to act on instinct instead of instruction. Men break ranks. They chase. They freeze. They run. Sometimes they fight too hard, with bloodlust that shatters cohesion. Commanders needed warriors who could remain obedient and clear-eyed inside that storm. people who could execute a plan instead of becoming the plan's first casualty. If Yoshinaka kept sending Tomoe into critical moments, it suggests she was not only lethal but controlled, able to follow intent under pressure, not just swing a blade until someone fell. That kind of reliability earns a particular form of respect, not praise, not admiration. The respect that shows itself when warriors obey. Male warriors would not have accepted a female captain out of enlightenment. They would have accepted her because war is a cruel teacher. Skepticism survives until results make skepticism expensive. When someone repeatedly succeeds in fights where others die, when decisions keep comrades alive, when leadership creates survival where panic would have created slaughter, practical minds adjust. Pride bends. Not willingly, not gracefully, but it bends. The trust Yoshinaka placed in Tomoe also mattered because the Genpei War was not only a war against the Taira, it was a war inside the Minamoto. Fractured loyalties, shifting alliances, and the constant possibility that today's retainer would become tomorrow's threat. In that environment, trust was not sentimental. It was a rare resource. Commanders needed people who would not disappear when the odds turned, who would not trade allegiance for safety at the first opportunity. The continued use of Tomoe in high-risk roles implies Yoshinaka believed she was that kind of warrior. Reliable under pressure, reliable under temptation, reliable when the outcome was uncertain. This is what emerges from her service under him. Not a token figure placed on the edges of war, but a working military asset, deployed where failure would be fatal, trusted because she produced results. Their relationship looks less like legend and more like the foundation medieval armies were built on. Trust purchased through repeated proof. But trust cannot stop the collapse of a political position. It cannot protect a commander who makes too many enemies, or a warrior whose reputation becomes dangerous once the fighting shifts from battlefield to purge. And when Yoshinaka's fortunes began to turn, Tomoe faced a question that battle skill could not answer, whether loyalty meant dying with him or surviving long enough to be erased by the victors who would never forgive what she proved possible. The accounts that survive do not describe Tomoe Gozen as merely competent. They describe her as physically formidable, strong enough that her strength was singled out even in a culture that praised warriors as a matter of habit. The Heike Monogatari calls her remarkably strong, language that in this context implies more than endurance or courage. Medieval warfare demanded brutal physical output, drawing heavy bows that could punch into armor, swinging blades for long stretches without the arms collapsing, controlling a horse while fighting, moving in armor that dragged at the body and stole breath. For Tomoe to be described as strong in the same breath as elite male warriors suggests she was not an exception explained by elegance or technique. She was, by the standards of the battlefield, powerful. And strength was only the foundation. Her swordsmanship is framed as elite, deadly enough to be measured in the language used for the most valuable warriors. A warrior worth 1,000 is often treated as poetry, but in war that kind of phrase is a verdict. A fighter whose presence changes the balance of what a commander can risk. Superior swordsmanship didn't mean graceful forms. It meant killing efficiently in chaos. When footing is unstable, when the enemy is trained, when exhaustion dulls timing, and one mistake ends everything. The Chronicles' mention of an oversized sword matters for the same reason. A weapon like that is not carried for display. If you can't control it, it becomes a liability. If you can, it becomes a statement of how you intend to end the fight. This kind of skill creates a specific terror, the recognition that you are not facing an equal, but someone operating above the range your experience prepared you for. In close quarters, that knowledge is corrosive. It shortens decisions. It makes men flinch. It makes them rush when they should wait, or freeze when they should strike. The sources also imply something rarer than strength or technique, the ability to function when outnumbered. Battles did not remain orderly for long. Lines broke. Groups collided. Warriors were swallowed into small, violent knots where threats came from multiple directions. To survive that, you needed more than bravery. You needed spatial awareness, judgment, and stamina that held under pressure. A fighter who can manage multiple opponents becomes a force multiplier in the most literal sense. One person creating local superiority even when the larger situation is deteriorating. The Heike language about confronting a demon or a god isn't just dramatic. It signals how far her reputation pushed beyond the normal scale of fear. And then there are the deeds of valor, a phrase that, in the context of this era, means killing, not merely being present, not merely enduring. Confirmed kills that could be witnessed, repeated, and carried back through the ranks as proof. This is where reputation becomes real. In medieval warfare, men were remembered by what could be verified: who they cut down, who they unhorsed, whose banner fell because of them. Tomoe's reputation was built inside that same economy of proof. Each recorded kill made her more than a rumor. It made her a known outcome. Repeated lethal combat also requires something many people never develop: the ability to keep functioning after the act. Killing at blade range is not abstract, it is intimate, physical, and hard to forget. Many warriors broke psychologically even if their bodies survived. That Tomoe could repeatedly engage and keep returning to the front suggests a kind of mental hardness that commanders prized and enemies feared, a person who doesn't hesitate, doesn't falter, doesn't slow down as the fight turns uglier. But the most powerful weapon she carried may have been the one that struck before any blade did: presence. In medieval warfare, reputation could shape a battle before it began. Fear degraded performance. It made men second-guess orders, hesitate at the wrong moment, and abandon positions they should have held. But reputation had to be earned. It had to survive repetition. The fact that the Heike Monogatari, compiled decades after the war, still names her when countless men were lost to anonymity, suggests her presence was not a local rumor. It was something that stuck, something enemies noticed and remembered. And Tomoe's reputation carried an additional shock that most feared warriors did not create: unpredictability. Male warriors assessed danger through patterns they understood: age, armor, weapons, banner, posture, unit. They expected other men, trained through the same culture, shaped by the same assumptions. Tomoe broke their threat models. Her gender created a moment of cognitive dissonance, an instinctive belief that she should not be a battlefield problem colliding with evidence that she already was. That conflict creates hesitation. It creates doubt. It forces a warrior to waste mental effort recalculating what he thought he knew, and in a fight measured in heartbeats, that recalculation can be fatal. There's also a deeper discomfort beneath the immediate fear. If a woman could do this, ride out, command, kill, and be recorded as superior to most men, then something about the world the warriors depended on was less stable than they wanted to admit. Not in theory, in practice. Tomoe's existence suggested that natural order was not as natural as it claimed, that exclusion might have been custom rather than necessity, that the masculine identity built around exclusive ownership of the battlefield might be, at its core, enforced rather than inevitable. Men did not have to articulate those thoughts to feel their weight. They only had to face the result: an opponent who violated expectation and punished underestimation. This is how reputation becomes a weapon, a cycle that feeds itself. Fear makes enemies fight worse. Worse performance creates more victories. More victories harden the legend into tactical reality. Soon, simply knowing she is present becomes a problem commanders have to solve. Whether to avoid her, target her, dismiss her, or risk learning too late that the stories were understated. And that is why men feared Tomoe Gozen. Not because she fought despite being a woman, because she fought like the war belonged to her, and because her existence made the battlefield feel suddenly less predictable, less controlled, and far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. Yoshinaka didn't fall because he forgot how to fight. He fell because politics closed around him faster than any battlefield could. After his victories against the Taira carried him into Kyoto in 1183, he stood at the center of Japan's collapsing authority with a sword in his hand and almost no understanding of what the capital demanded from the man who held it. He had been raised in the provinces, away from the habits of court power. That distance made him dangerous in war and helpless in the room where war is turned into legitimacy. Kyoto was not just a city, it was a stage. The court survived by ritual, by protocol, by appearances that made violence look like order. Yoshinaka's men were provincial warriors, loyal to him and contemptuous of aristocratic refinements. Their behavior scandalized the people he needed to reassure. He made decisions that looked, to the court, like instability and threat. Attempts to negotiate were read as betrayal. Seizing power without the right forms created enemies among those who could undermine him with letters and whispers as effectively as any army. And worst of all, he collided with Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoshinaka was Minamoto, but he was not the Minamoto the future belonged to. Yoritomo, building authority from Kamakura, was consolidating a new order, controlled, disciplined, centralized around his name. Yoshinaka, with his provincial coalition and his blunt presence in Kyoto, became a liability, an unpredictable cousin holding the capital in a way that could poison the Minamoto victory. By late 1183, the decision had been made. Yoshinaka would not be negotiated with. He would be removed. Yoritomo sent armies under his brothers, Yoshitsune and Noriyori, against him, and the collapse came with terrifying speed. Allies began to vanish. The court, controlled by Yoshinaka in name, worked against him in practice, communicating with Yoritomo and welcoming intervention as rescue. Warriors who had followed Yoshinaka for glory recalculated in silence and drifted toward the side that would survive. His territorial base shrank as Yoritomo's forces advanced, and local powers submitted to avoid being crushed in the middle. Momentum, Yoshinaka's greatest weapon, became his enemy. Once it turned completely. By January 1184, he was trapped near Kyoto with a force reduced from thousands to hundreds. He faced an enemy that outnumbered him on a scale that made tactics irrelevant. This was the cost of political failure, the moment when military skill becomes meaningless because the world has decided you will be erased. The end came at Owazu on February 21st, 1184. It was less a battle than an execution carried out with the machinery of overwhelming force. Yoshinaka fought anyway. Whether it was honor, defiance, or the last irrational hope that a final victory could rewrite his fate, it didn't matter. The outcome was already fixed. His men were exhausted. There were no reinforcements coming, no escape that wasn't immediate flight. Owazu was the kind of fight where survival belongs only to those who leave, or those who die quickly enough not to be taken. The Heike-monogatari still places Tomoe there, still at his side, still functioning as the warrior the sources insist she was. Even in Collapse, she's described as killing enemy warriors, actions that read less like heroic ornament and more like proof that her effectiveness did not depend on victory. She could still do the work of a battlefield commander while the world around her was ending. Then comes the moment that exposes the fracture beneath the story. According to the chronicle, Yoshinaka ordered Tomoe to leave, an order that cuts against the very ideal later warrior culture claimed to worship. Dying with one's lord in hopeless battle became a symbol of ultimate loyalty. To be told to survive, to abandon the death that would seal devotion, was not an ordinary command. It suggests Yoshinaka was torn between the value he placed on her as a warrior and the cultural assumptions he never fully escaped. The text even attributes to him the belief that dying alongside a woman would be shameful, that he wanted to meet death only among men. It is a brutal contradiction. He relied on her as first captain, entrusted her with critical roles, used her competence to stay alive. And at the end, when the last image mattered more than the last result, the world's old logic surged back into place. Her presence at his death was suddenly something that needed to be removed. Tomoe obeyed. The chronicle frames her departure as more than retreat. It gives her one final feat, one last killing in single combat, before she rides away and disappears from the record. Later versions would elaborate the scene, adding trophies and dramatic emphasis, as if the story cannot allow her to leave without a concluding proof of violence. But the core remains the same. She exits the battlefield alive, and the narrative immediately loses sight of her. That choice has been argued over for centuries because it refuses to sit comfortably inside the categories people want. Was it loyalty, obedience to direct orders from the man she served? Was it pragmatism, refusing to die in a gesture that changed nothing? Was it shame, as later moralizing retellings implied, an abandonment disguised as survival? The very existence of the debate reveals the deeper problem. The culture didn't know how to process a female warrior, making the same calculation male warriors made all the time. Men retreated, switched sides, survived disasters, and reappeared later with new banners. But when Tomoe did the simplest thing a living person can do, leave a killing field, her story became unstable. After Owazu, the historical trail goes cold. Legends rush to fill the silence. She became a nun, she married, she died soon after, she vanished into another life. None of these endings can be confirmed from reliable sources. They read like closures imposed by later societies that could not tolerate an open question, especially not one attached to a woman who had lived outside the expected frame. The absence could be accidental, the same disappearance that swallowed most medieval lives. It could be deliberate erasure, a quiet decision by chroniclers that her story should not continue past the moment it was useful for explaining Yoshinaka's fall. Or it could be her own strategy, vanishing because peacetime would have no place for a woman whose identity had been built in war. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same. The warrior Tomoe Gozen ends at the exact moment the world begins tightening its rules again. The Genpei War would continue. The Taira would be pursued and destroyed. A new military order would settle over Japan. But Tomoe's documented war ends here, at the moment her commander is crushed, and her path forward becomes more dangerous than any battlefield. Because surviving Owazu was not the hard part. The hard part was what came after, living in a world that remembered what she had been, and had every reason to make sure she could never be it again. Female warriors do not disturb history merely by existing at the margins. They disturb it by breaking the logic that patriarchy depends on. A society that claims men monopolize war because men are naturally suited for it cannot easily absorb evidence of women who fought, commanded, and were feared. Because the moment that evidence is allowed to stand without explanation, the hierarchy stops looking inevitable and starts looking chosen. That is the real danger, not the individual woman. The implication: if a woman can lead troops, kill enemy warriors, and earn respect through competence, then exclusion can't be defended as necessity. It has to be recognized as control, maintained for the benefit of those who rule. And once a society is forced to admit that gender roles are constructed, contingent and enforceable rather than natural, it risks something worse than scandal. It risks collapse of the story it tells itself about why power belongs where it does. So the narrative has to be managed. There are only a few tools for that management, and they appear again and again wherever women break into spaces reserved for men. You can isolate her as an impossible exception, an aberration so rare she doesn't threaten the rule. You can romanticize her until her violence is no longer central, until her competence becomes secondary to her emotional relationship with a man. Or you can minimize her into near silence, letting her name survive only as a faint shadow that can be dismissed as rumor. Tomoe Gozen was subjected to all three. The historical core is simple and difficult. She fought as a commander. She killed. She was trusted. She was recorded. That is what makes her threatening. Later culture could not erase that core completely because it was embedded too deep in the tradition. But it could reshape everything around it until the core no longer felt dangerous. Over centuries, Tomoe's image was gradually transformed from documented military figure into a safer character. Her story was retold for audiences that lived under different assumptions, different social needs, and different anxieties. And by the Edo period, under the Tokugawa shogunate, when stability was prized and hierarchy was enforced as policy, those retellings increasingly leaned toward containment. Beauty moved to the foreground, loyalty became emotional devotion, violence was softened, reframed, or quietly removed. The warrior became a romantic heroine whose fighting could be explained as love, not as professional identity. That shift mattered because it changed what her story meant. A woman who fights because she is capable suggests capacity exists, where the system insists it does not. A woman who fights because she is devoted to a man can be absorbed. The first challenges the structure, the second reinforces it. The erasure of violence was essential to this process. You can't romanticize a sword without dulling it. The Heike Monogatari describes Tomoe's killing in matter-of-fact terms, as it describes male warriors, as deeds witnessed and counted. Later versions prefer her as image rather than as force, an aesthetic of strength rather than the physical reality of organized killing. Blood disappears. Exhaustion disappears. The weight of armor and the cruelty of close combat disappear. Once that happens, Tomoe is no longer a soldier in war. She becomes a symbol performing warfare, a figure safe to admire because she no longer carries the full implication of what she did. And that was not accidental. It was culturally useful. The Tokugawa order promoted rigid hierarchy and rigid gender roles. Women were expected to be domestic, obedient, subordinate, first to fathers, then to husbands, then to sons. They could be educated, but for management, not for authority. They were praised for loyalty and self-sacrifice, not for independent accomplishment or public achievement. A medieval woman who exercised command, made decisions in battle, and killed men in open warfare was not merely inconvenient. She was a contradiction. She was proof that the boundary was not eternal. So the contradiction had to be resolved, either by deletion or by reinterpretation. The romantic transformation of Tomoe served that resolution. It allowed her to remain known while stripping her of what made her politically dangerous. Her story could be told, but only if it taught the correct lesson, that even when a woman steps into war, it is still about devotion, still about beauty, still about serving a male narrative, not about competence that stands on its own. This is how historical memory works under control. It doesn't always require coordinated censorship. More often it operates through accumulated choices by storytellers, artists, writers, and audiences who learn what is rewarded, what is tolerated, what is punished. Over time, the versions that fit the social order spread easily. The versions that complicate it become rare, academic, or quietly mocked as unrealistic. History isn't simply lost, it is selected, and the selection has a cost. Not only to Tomoe, whose actual accomplishments were blurred into something decorative, but to the generations of women who lived under a tightened system with fewer models of what had once been possible. When a society removes evidence that women have done something, it doesn't just change the past, it narrows the future. It makes restriction feel natural because alternatives are no longer visible. It teaches women what they are allowed to imagine and teaches men what they are allowed to accept. Controlling the memory of female warriors was therefore not an academic issue. It was ideological infrastructure. It shaped what a society believed about capability, legitimacy, and the boundaries of gender itself. A Tomoe remembered accurately as a problem. She suggests that training and opportunity matter, that competence can exist where it is denied, that exclusion is policy rather than fate. A Tomoe remembered as tragic romance is a solution. She becomes a story that can be enjoyed without changing anything. The work of erasure was never total. The earlier descriptions survived. Tomoe's name did not vanish. But the dominant version most people encountered was a managed version, safe enough to be celebrated, soft enough to be absorbed, distant enough from blood to avoid the unsettling conclusion the original record implies. And that is the point. When history chooses what to remember, it is never history choosing. It is power choosing through culture, through institutions, through repetition. It remembers what stabilizes the present. It forgets what could threaten it. Tomoe Gozen survived in Fragments because she could not be fully destroyed, but she was reshaped because her unmodified existence made a promise that later societies could not afford to let women hear, that the limits placed on them were not timeless truths, only rules enforced by those who benefited from them. Tomoe Gozen is not a symbol designed for modern consumption. She is not an ancient proto-feminist placed in the past to validate the present. She did not ride into battle to make a point about gender. She lived inside 12th century Japan, inside a warrior culture that measured worth through survival, loyalty, and effectiveness. And she made choices shaped by that world's values and constraints, not by ours. Any attempt to turn her into a clean icon for contemporary debate risks doing the same thing later centuries already did, reshaping her into something useful and therefore less true. Her significance isn't in what we want her to represent today. It's in what her documented existence exposes about the gap between what people can do and what societies allow them to do. Tomoe was not a decorative exception placed in the record to suggest enlightened attitudes. The Heike Monogatari does not mention her to celebrate women in warfare. It mentions her because her presence in Yoshinaka's campaigns was too substantial to leave out without damaging the account's credibility. Even the text's framing reveals discomfort. It acknowledges her ability, but it marks her as unusual, as something that requires explanation. That is the tell. She is not an ornament. She is a disruption, an element the narrative can't fully absorb, but cannot fully deny. If she had been token, she would have been easier to erase. Instead, the record keeps her because the operations don't make sense without her. It places her in command. It places her in the vanguard. It describes her deeds in the same register used for male warriors: measurable, witnessed, lethal. The fact that she appears at all in sources that otherwise compress women into domestic or romantic roles suggests her military relevance exceeded the threshold of convenient silence. What Tomoe represents, then, is not progress. It is failure. Failure of a system designed to keep women away from military training, away from battlefield authority, away from the kind of competence that makes exclusion look like what it is. According to the logic of gender ideology, she should not have been able to do what she did. Women were not supposed to have the strength, the psychological durability, or the tactical authority that warfare demanded. They were certainly not supposed to command men effectively. Tomoe proved those assumptions wrong without arguing against them. She proved them wrong by functioning anyway, by doing the work, surviving it, and being trusted with it again and again. She becomes the exception that exposes the lie beneath the rule, that exclusion was not inevitability, but enforcement, maintained by controlling training, opportunity, and access. Her existence also reveals something colder about war itself. War does not respect ideology. It rewards whatever keeps you alive. In the Genpei War's pressure, Yoshinaka needed capability more than he needed conformity. He could not afford to waste a battlefield asset because it violated peacetime expectations. That is why Tomoe could operate at that level, not because society had become enlightened, but because the stakes were too immediate to indulge prejudice at the cost of effectiveness. Competence rose above identity because identity was a luxury that didn't stop arrows. That doesn't mean the hierarchy disappeared. It means the hierarchy bent under emergency and snapped back when the emergency ended. This is the most revealing pattern in her story, the way pragmatism appears in crisis and vanishes in stability. Gender restrictions are easiest to enforce when a society can afford to waste potential. When survival is on the line, the enforcement weakens. When order returns, the restrictions return with it, often harsher than before, because the memory of exception feels threatening. Tomoe's survival makes this even sharper. She endured years of warfare, endured battles that killed most who entered them, and appears to have outlived the political disaster that destroyed her commander. That survival is not sentimental. It is the brutal merit war recognizes physical capability, judgment, resilience, the ability to function when others break. But her merit did not translate into secure status once the war shifted. The record stops where peacetime begins. Her power, real power, exercised over men in war, was never something granted by a benevolent system. It was conquered through usefulness. And the moment that usefulness became politically inconvenient, the story retreats into silence. That is why later societies could reshape her. A warrior who earned command through competence is a threat to an order built on categorical entitlement. If power can be taken through ability, if war can momentarily override gender, then legitimacy becomes less sacred than it pretends to be. Tomoe embodied that danger. So the world did what worlds like this always do. It managed her. It softened her. It made her safe. It turned a battlefield commander into a story that could be admired without changing anything. But the original record refuses to let her be reduced completely. It measures her by the same standards as men. It places her among warriors, not beside them. It shows her taking roles that were not impressive for a woman, but simply effective. Effective enough to be remembered when most were forgotten. So what Tomoe Gozen really represents is not a comfortable symbol. She is an uncomfortable fact. She proves that the boundaries societies draw around gender are not laws of nature. They are systems. They are maintained through control of opportunity and training, reinforced through story and protected through selective memory. Her existence does not mean medieval Japan was egalitarian. It means that even in a society built to exclude women from war, exclusion could fail. When circumstances became desperate enough, and when an individual was capable enough to force reality through the cracks. And that leaves the final question. Her story refuses to answer cleanly. If one Tomoe made it into the record, how many others never had the chance, never found a Yoshinaka, never entered a war that needed them badly enough, and were buried so completely that history didn't even have to rewrite them? Tomoe Gozen was not remembered because she was a woman. She was remembered because she was dangerous. In a world where weakness meant death, she survived by being better than everyone around her. And that is why history tried to soften her. If this story changed how you see samurai warfare, subscribe to Fragments of History, leave a like, and comment below. Was Tomoe Gozen an exception, or proof that history hid many others like her?